Colorado Territory, 1878. The whistle of the arriving train pierced the crisp mountain air, promising new beginnings and dashed hopes in equal measure. Among the passengers disembarking at Summit Creek Station was Harriet Winters, a schoolteacher. From Boston, with intelligent eyes, a spine straight as a ruler, and a heart that had withstood enough disappointment to know better than to hope too fiercely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Yet hope she did. Clutching a letter promising marriage to a successful shop owner named Theodore Patterson. The correspondence had been proper, his promises reasonable, and his need for an educated wife to help with his business affairs seemed sincere. After her father's death left her with mounting debts and few prospects in Boston, the advertisement in the matrimonial news had offered an honorable escape. Harriet stepped onto the wooden platform, her modest trunk containing everything she owned: books, teaching materials, and the practical clothing befitting her new life in the West. She smoothed her travel-worn skirt and scanned the faces of those waiting at the station. Searching for the man whose daguerreotype she carried in her reticule, no one stepped forward. As the platform gradually emptied of arriving passengers and waiting townspeople, Harriet remained, the mountain wind cutting through her eastern coat with growing intensity as the shadows lengthened. Theodore Patterson, it seemed, had changed his mind. What Harriet couldn't know, as she faced the first bitter night alone in a strange town, was that 5 days later, her life would take an unexpected turn when a man whose face bore the marks of his own private war would offer her a proposition unlike any she could have imagined. The Summit Creek Hotel was a 2-story clapboard building that had once aspired to elegance, but now wore the tired expression of faded ambition. Still, it offered clean rooms and hot meals, luxuries Harriet could ill afford, but couldn't do without on her first night in unfamiliar territory. "I'm expecting Mr. Theodore Patterson," she explained to the desk clerk, a thin man with spectacles that magnified his already suspicious eyes. "He was to meet me at the station, but perhaps there was a misunderstanding about the time." The clerk's expression shifted from boredom to something uncomfortably close to pity. "Patterson, the mercantile owner?" "Yes, that's right. We've been corresponding for several months regarding a matrimonial arrangement." The clerk cleared his throat, suddenly finding great interest in the register book. "Miss, perhaps you should speak with Sheriff Donovan in the morning. I believe there's been a situation with Mr. Patterson." Harriet's stomach tightened, but her voice remained level. "What sort of situation?" "Not my place to say, ma'am." He slid a room key across the counter. "Room 4, top of the stairs. Dining room serves breakfast from 6 to 8. That night, Harriet lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of a western town settling for the evening, so different from Boston's constant hum. Piano music drifted from the saloon down the street, punctuated occasionally by shouts or laughter. Her mind catalogued possible explanations. Theodore had fallen ill, encountered business difficulties, or perhaps had been called away unexpectedly. The alternative, that he had deliberately failed to meet her, was too humiliating to contemplate. Yet as dawn broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across her sparse room, Harriet faced the day with the practical resolve that had carried her through her father's illness and death. She dressed in her second-best traveling outfit, arranged her chestnut hair in a simple but neat style, and headed downstairs with purpose in her step. Sheriff Donovan's office sat between the general store and the town's only lawyer, a brick building with a weather-beaten sign and a hitching post where a dappled mare dozed in the early morning light. The sheriff himself proved to be a broad-shouldered man with a graying mustache and kind eyes that couldn't quite hide his discomfort as Harriet introduced herself. "Miss Winters," he began, gesturing to a wooden chair, "I wish your arrival in Summit Creek could be under better circumstances. Please speak plainly, Sheriff. What has happened to Mr. Patterson?" Donovan sighed. "Theodore Patterson left town 3 weeks ago, miss. Packed up overnight, sold his store to his assistant, and departed on the eastbound train. According to Miller at the bank, Patterson withdrew nearly all his funds before leaving." Harriet sat, perfectly still, only her whitening knuckles revealing the impact of his words. "I received a letter from him 2 weeks ago confirming our arrangements. I'm sorry, miss. He had debts all over town, gambling mostly. Word is he's headed to St. Louis or beyond." "And he knew I was arriving today," Harriet stated rather than asked, the full weight of the deception settling over her. "His assistant mentioned something about a bride coming." Donovan shuffled papers on his desk, likely why he chose this particular time to disappear. The practical implications crashed through Harriet's carefully constructed plans. She was over 2,000 miles from Boston, her return fare spent on settling her father's final medical bills, with accommodation she could afford for perhaps a week before her meager savings were exhausted. "Is there an opportunity for a teacher in Summit Creek, Sheriff?" Donovan's expression answered before his words. "Town council hired a new schoolmaster just last month. Young fellow from Denver University." "I see." Harriet rose, straightening her shoulders. "Thank you for your candor. I'll need to consider my options." "Miss Winters," Donovan called as she reached the door, "there's a Women's Aid Society at the church. Mrs. Hollister runs it. They might be able to help until you sort things out." The suggestion of charity stung, but Harriet nodded her acknowledgement before stepping back into the morning sunshine that seemed to mock her predicament. The next 3 days passed in a blur of increasingly desperate inquiries. The hotel proprietress allowed Harriet to work for her lodging, cleaning rooms and serving in the dining room, but made it clear this arrangement couldn't be permanent. Mrs. Hollister from the church provided names of families who might need a governess, but none were immediately promising. "You seem a capable sort," Mrs. Hollister remarked, studying Harriet over her teacup in the church meeting room. "Not like some of the mail-order brides who arrive expecting a palace and finding a tent. But Summit Creek isn't Boston. A woman alone has limited prospects here." "I'm discovering that," Harriet replied, maintaining her composure, though her options narrowed by the hour. "There's always domestic service at the mining company houses," Mrs. Hollister suggested. "Or perhaps," she hesitated, lowering her voice, "the Jasper Hotel in Red Cliff often needs young women for their establishment." "I think not, Mrs. Hollister." Harriet's tone made it clear that particular conversation was finished by her. 5th day in Summit Creek, Harriet had developed a routine born of necessity. Mornings were spent cleaning hotel rooms, afternoons pursuing any employment lead, no matter how slim, and evenings calculating how many days remained before she would need to sell her father's pocket watch, the last family heirloom she possessed. It was during one such evening, as Harriet sat in the hotel's small dining room with ledger and pencil, that the atmosphere in the room subtly shifted. Conversations quieted, and heads turned toward the entrance. Unable to help herself, Harriet glanced up to see what had caused the reaction. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered in a well-worn duster, his hat pulled low over his face. As he stepped into the lamplight, Harriet understood the room's response. The right side of the man's face was unmarked, and might once have been considered handsome, with strong features and clear eyes. The left side, however, bore a web of scars that pulled his mouth into a permanent half-grimace, and had clearly damaged the ear on that side. The newcomer scanned the room with the awareness of someone accustomed to such reactions, his gaze briefly meeting Harriet's before she could politely look away. Whatever he saw in her expression caused him to pause momentarily before continuing to a corner table where the hotel proprietress hurried to take his order. Harriet returned to her calculations, though she remained aware of the man's presence in her peripheral vision. Conversations gradually resumed around the room, and she had almost forgotten the interruption when a shadow fell across her table. "Miss Winters?" The voice was deep and surprisingly gentle. Harriet looked up to find the scarred man standing beside her table, hat now held in hands that showed the marks of hard work. "Yes," she responded, closing her ledger instinctively. "Name's Gabriel Stone. I own the Double Bar Ranch about 20 miles north of here." He gestured to the empty chair across from her. "May I speak with you a moment?" Curiosity overcoming caution, Harriet nodded. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a clear grey blue, with lines at the corners suggesting he'd once smiled more often than he did now. "Sheriff Donovan mentioned your situation," he continued once seated, direct but not unkind. "Said, you came west expecting marriage and found yourself stranded instead." Embarrassment heated Harriet's cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "News travels quickly in Summit Creek, it seems. Small towns run on gossip like steam engines run on coal." A hint of sympathy colored his words. "I understand you're seeking employment." "I am. I'm a qualified teacher with experience in Boston's grammar schools, though I'm willing to consider other respectable positions." Gabriel Stone studied her with an intensity that might have been uncomfortable if not for the complete absence of impropriety in his manner. "I have a proposition, Miss Winters, not the one you came west expecting, but perhaps of mutual benefit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "My ranch is prosperous enough. Good water, decent grazing land. I employ 6 hands full-time, more during carving and branding, but the house has been neglected since my housekeeper returned east to care for her ailing mother." "You're offering me a position as your housekeeper?" Harriet clarified, relief at the prospect of respectable employment, warring with dismay at the idea of domestic service. "Not exactly." Gabriel shifted slightly, the scarred side of his face catching the lamplight. "I'm proposing marriage, Miss Winters, but not the kind you likely envisioned. This would be a marriage of convenience, a business arrangement, if you will. You would run my household, maintain the accounts, and have the protection of my name. In exchange, you'd have security, a home, and a monthly allowance for personal needs." Harriet sat perfectly still, processing his unexpected offer. "Mr. Stone, you don't know me at all. Why would you propose such an arrangement to a complete stranger?" "Because my ranch needs someone with education and capability, not just another pair of hands to scrub floors. Because Summit Creek has limited options for a woman in your position, and because Sheriff Donovan vouched for your character based on your conduct these past days." He paused. "And I suspect we're both practical enough to recognize when an imperfect solution is better than none at all." "And, other aspects of marriage?" Harriet asked delicately, feeling heat rise to her face despite her best efforts. "Separate quarters," he answered immediately. "No expectations beyond what I've stated. If either of us finds the arrangement unsatisfactory, we can discuss dissolution after a year." The offer was simultaneously shocking and oddly respectful. Gabriel Stone wasn't asking for her hand out of passion or even particular interest. He was proposing a pragmatic solution to both their problems. It was honest, at least, which was more than she could say for Theodore Patterson's promises. "May I ask?" Harriet began, then hesitated, unsure how to politely inquire about the scars that had clearly shaped his life as much as his face. "The war," he supplied, answering her unspoken question. "Battle of the Wilderness, artillery shell. I was luckier than most. I walked away." His matter-of-fact tone held neither self-pity nor defensiveness. "It's why I propose this particular type of arrangement, Miss Winters. I've no illusions about inspiring romantic attachment, nor do I seek it. What I need is order restored to my home and competent management of domestic affairs." Harriet considered his words carefully. In Boston, such a proposal would have been scandalous, but Boston was 2,000 miles and a lifetime away. Here in the Colorado mountains, different rules applied, practical rules shaped by harsh realities and limited choices. "Your offer is unexpected, Mr. Stone," she finally said. "I would need time to consider it." He nodded, unsurprised. "I'm in town until tomorrow afternoon. My foreman, Matthews, is handling a supply order at Bailey's Mercantile." He rose, settling his hat back on his head. "If you decide to accept, I'll be leaving at 3. If not, I wish you good fortune in your endeavors, Miss Winters." After he departed, Harriet remained at the table long after the other diners had cleared out, her ledger forgotten before her. Gabriel Stone's proposition was hardly the future she had envisioned when boarding the train in Boston, yet it offered something her correspondence with Theodore Patterson never had: complete honesty about what awaited her. That night, Harriet lay awake, weighing her options, with the methodical care her father had taught her when reviewing contracts. A marriage, in name only to a scarred rancher she'd met once, was hardly ideal. Yet the alternatives, domestic service in the mining camps, returning to Boston in humiliating defeat if she could even afford the fare, or worse options that Mrs. Hollister had delicately hinted at, seemed equally unpalatable. Dawn found her still undecided, though she rose and dressed with particular care, selecting her one good dress, navy blue with modest lace at the collar, and arranging her hair in a simple but becoming style. Whatever her decision, she would face it looking her best. The morning passed in a blur of hotel duties and mental debate. By noon, Harriet found herself walking toward Bailey's Mercantile with no clear memory of having decided to do so. The store was larger than she expected, well stocked with everything from farm implements to fabric, evidence that Summit Creek was growing despite its remote location. Near the counter, a weathered man in his 50s was reviewing a supply list with the clerk. This, Harriet guessed, must be Matthews, the foreman Gabriel had mentioned. Something about his steady manner as he methodically worked through each item gave her a glimpse into the type of operation Gabriel Stone must run. Organized, thorough, no detail overlooked. "Excuse me," she ventured when there was a pause in their transaction. "Are you from the Double Bar Ranch?" The man turned, assessing her with a quick glance. "Yes, ma'am. Tom Matthews, foreman." Recognition dawned in his eyes. "You must be Miss Winters. Mr. Stone mentioned he'd spoken with you." "Yes. I wonder... That is, I'd like to ask." To her frustration, Harriet found herself uncharacteristically at a loss for words. Matthews saved her from her awkwardness. "About the ranch, I expect? Or about Mr. Stone himself?" "Both, I suppose." Matthews nodded thoughtfully. "Double Bar's good land. Been there since '65 when Mr. Stone came back from the war. Started with just a claim and 20 head of cattle. Now runs near 800 head on 6,000 acres. Pride colored his voice. "As for Mr. Stone himself, he's a fair man. Expects honest work but pays honest wages. Keeps his word once given. And his temperament?" Harriet asked carefully. "Quieter than most. Reads more books than any man I know." Matthews studied her with unexpected perceptiveness. "The scars keep him from town most times, but they didn't touch what matters. He's the same man inside as before that shell hit. Just fewer folks get to know it now." Harriet absorbed this assessment, finding comfort in the genuine respect evident in the foreman's manner. "Thank you, Mr. Matthews. You've been most helpful. We leave at 3, Miss Winters, if you're of a mind to join us." He tipped his hat and returned to his supply list, giving her the privacy to make her decision without pressure. Outside, Summit Creek bustled with midday activity. Harriet walked slowly through the town that had so disappointed her hopes, past the mercantile that should have been Theodore Patterson's, the school where she might have taught in different circumstances, and finally to the station where she had arrived 5 days earlier with such different expectations. The mountains rose beyond the town, massive and indifferent to human concerns, a landscape that demanded strength and adaptability from those who chose to make their homes in its shadow. Boston, with its familiar streets and social conventions, seemed to belong to another world entirely, or perhaps to another woman, one who no longer existed after the trials of recent months. As the town clock struck 2:30, Harriet returned to the hotel to collect her trunk, her decision made. Whatever awaited her at the Double Bar Ranch, it would be of her own choosing, not a fate thrust upon her by a man's broken promises or society's limited options. Gabriel Stone had offered honesty and respect, if not romance, in a world where even the most beautiful promises had proven false. Perhaps plain truth was the most valuable currency of all. The journey to the Double Bar Ranch revealed a Colorado that travel brochures and railroad advertisements never depicted. As the wagon rumbled away from Summit Creek, the primitive road wound through terrain that alternated between breathtaking and forbidding, towering pines giving way to rocky passages where the wheels jolted against stone, then opening to meadows speckled with wildflowers and grazing deer. Harriet sat beside Matthews on the wagon bench, her trunk secured in the back alongside supplies from town. Gabriel rode slightly ahead on a powerful chestnut gelding, his straight-backed posture revealing years of military training that even civilian life hadn't erased. They had spoken little since departure, the agreement between them sealed with a handshake rather than flowing sentiment. "It's farther from town than I expected," Harriet remarked, as they crossed a swift-running stream, the wagon wheels splashing through the ford. "Double Bar sits in North Fork Valley," Matthews explained. "Good water year-round, sheltered from the worst winter storms, worth the extra distance." The valley, when they finally crested the ridge that revealed it, stretched before them like an illustration from a storybook. Green pastures bisected by a meandering creek, herds of cattle dotting the landscape, and nestled against the base of a timber-covered hillside, a sprawling ranch house built of logs and local stone. Outbuildings formed a rough semicircle behind the main house, with corrals and a substantial barn completing the compound. "It's beautiful," Harriet said softly, the knot of anxiety in her chest loosening slightly at the unexpected appeal of her new home. Gabriel, who had waited for the wagon at the ridge, glanced at her with an expression that might have been relief. "The valley looks its best this time of year," he acknowledged. "Spring runoff keeps everything green until mid-July." The ranch hands emerged from the barn and bunkhouse as the wagon approached. 6 men, ranging in age from barely 20 to well past 50, their expressions openly curious about the woman accompanying their employer. Gabriel made brief introductions. Williams, Cooper, the Henson brothers Jim and John, young Tyler barely out of boyhood, and Martinez, whose family had worked this land before it was ever called Colorado. "Miss Winters will be managing the household," Gabriel explained, his tone making it clear this wasn't an occasion for questions or commentary. "She's had a long journey. Martinez helped with her trunk." The interior of the ranch house told a more complicated story than its impressive exterior suggested. The great room that served as both parlor and dining area showed signs of having once been well appointed. Quality furniture arranged with care, bookshelves lining one wall, a stone fireplace large enough to warm the entire space. But a layer of dust-covered surfaces, a corner of the rug had been chewed by some animal, and dishes from at least 2 meals remained on the sideboard. "Caroline, my former housekeeper, left 3 weeks ago," Gabriel explained, following Harriet's gaze. "The hands have taken meals in the bunkhouse since then. I've been," he gestured vaguely, "managing." "I see." Harriet kept her tone neutral, though the task before her was clearly larger than she'd anticipated. Is there a designated household budget? Ledgers in my study with the ranch accounts. Gabriel seemed to relax slightly at her practical response. Caroline ordered monthly. Supplies from Summit Creek with additional purchases as needed. And staff, is there a cook or housemaid? Martinez's wife Maria comes 3 days a week for laundry and heavier cleaning. Otherwise, it's been just Caroline managing things. He hesitated. The house was different when my sister lived here. After she married and moved to Denver 2 years ago, things simplified. As Gabriel showed her through the house, kitchen with its massive iron stove, pantry surprisingly well stocked, dining room that could seat 12 comfortably, study-lined, with more books than she'd expected, and upstairs to a hallway with 4 bedrooms, Harriet catalogued what needed immediate attention and what could wait. This room was Caroline's, Gabriel said, opening a door to reveal a pleasant chamber with a brass bed, washstand, and wardrobe. I thought you might prefer it to the smaller guest rooms. There's a sitting room adjoining it. He indicated another, a door within the bedroom. It's lovely, Harriet replied, genuinely pleased with the arrangement. And your quarters? Master bedroom's at the end of the hall. He pointed in the opposite direction. Study downstairs connects to it by a private staircase. The boundaries of their arrangement thus physically established, Gabriel left her to settle in, mentioning that dinner was typically at 6 and Martinez would bring water for washing shortly. Alone, for the first time since making her momentous decision, Harriet sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling slightly as the enormity of her situation washed over her. She had left Boston a mail-order bride, been abandoned by her intended husband, and now found herself technically married to a stranger whose face bore the ravages of war and whose home needed as much tending as his land. Yet as she unpacked her trunk, hanging dresses in the wardrobe, arranging her father's books on the small shelf by the window, placing her mother's silver-backed hairbrush on the washstand, Harriet felt something unexpectedly like hope taking root. Gabriel Stone had been honest in his proposition. The house, despite its current state, was solid and well built. The valley was undeniably beautiful. Most importantly, she had agency in this arrangement, not the passive recipient of Theodore Patterson's broken promises, but an active participant in a practical partnership. Martinez's wife Maria proved to be a blessing Harriet hadn't anticipated. The woman arrived the next morning, her English limited, but her domestic skills exceptional, with Maria's help translating practical knowledge into action, which pump provided the best drinking water, how the temperamental stove needed to be, coaxed to proper temperature, where linens were stored. Harriet began the task of restoring order to the double bar. Their first shared meal that evening, a simple but hearty stew Maria had prepared before departing, passed in relative silence, both Harriet and Gabriel seemingly unsure of the proper conventions for their unusual situation. It was only as they finished that Gabriel cleared his throat and addressed the practical matters at hand. The ranch accounts need reviewing, he said, pushing back from the table. Caroline managed the household expenses separately, but everything should be consolidated now that you're here. Harriet followed him to the study, where ledgers and papers covered a substantial desk by the window. My father was an attorney, she explained, taking the chair he offered. I assisted with his accounts for several years. I'm comfortable with bookkeeping. Gabriel nodded, pulling a second chair beside her rather than assuming his place behind. The desk. Double Bar runs about 800 head of cattle now, with 50 horses, some for ranch use, others we breed and sell. Spring calving just finished, and we'll drive 200 head to the railroad at Granite Junction for sale next month. As he explained the ranch operations, Harriet was struck by the transformation in his manner. The hesitancy she'd noticed earlier vanished when he spoke of the land and animals, replaced by confidence and clear expertise. His finger traced figures in the ledger, explaining expenses, projected income, and plans for expanding water access to the north pastures. "You've built something substantial," Harriet observed when he finished. "From 20 cattle to 800 in 13 years is impressive growth." "The land does the real work," Gabriel replied, though she noted the hint of pride in his tone. "I just try not to get in its way." Nevertheless, good stewardship requires intelligence and foresight. These accounts show both. Harriet turned pages in the household ledger, noting Caroline's neat entries. "I'll need a few days to familiarize myself with everything, but I see no reason the household and ranch accounts can't be properly integrated." That night, as Harriet prepared for bed in her new room, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. In Boston, she had been invisible, one of countless unmarried women of a certain age whose prospects diminished with each passing year. Theodore Patterson's initial letters had offered recognition of her intelligence and capabilities, but his subsequent abandonment had revealed the hollowness of his regard. Gabriel Stone, by contrast, had made no flowery promises about valuing her mind or spirit. Yet his actions, providing a comfortable room, readily sharing the ranch's financial details, treating her questions with seriousness, demonstrated a fundamental respect that required no verbal decoration. The following weeks established a pattern that suited Harriet's practical nature. Mornings were spent bringing the household management up to her standards, inventorying supplies, establishing proper cleaning routines, planning meals that balanced the economy with nutrition. Afternoons often found her at the desk in the study, integrating the separate accounting systems into one comprehensive record that gave a clearer picture of the ranch's overall health. Gabriel spent most daylight hours with the ranch hands, returning for the evening meal usually bearing evidence of physical labor, sun-darkened skin, occasional minor injuries from working with livestock, the healthy exhaustion of meaningful work. Though their conversations remained largely focused on ranch matters, Harriet began to discover layers to her husband in name only that his reserved manner concealed. The bookshelves in the great room and study, she learned, weren't merely decorative. Gabriel was a voracious reader with wide-ranging interests: history, agriculture, poetry, even novels that she wouldn't have expected to appeal to a cattle rancher. Sometimes in the evenings, she would enter the great room to find him absorbed in the volume, the scarred side of his face turned toward the fire, as if both hiding and illuminating the marks of his past. "You seem surprised," he remarked one evening, catching her observing him with a collection of Wordsworth open on his knee. "Not surprised, precisely," Harriet replied, taking a seat across from him with her mending basket. "Just noting that you contain multitudes, Mr. Stone." The literary reference earned her the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, transforming his face in a way that momentarily overshadowed the scars. Walt Whitman. "My sister Elizabeth insisted I continue my education after the war. Said if I was determined to isolate myself in the mountains, I should at least have good company and books." This glimpse into his history invited questions, but Harriet restrained her curiosity. Their arrangement was proceeding amicably precisely because neither pressed for more than the other offered freely. Yet as days turned to weeks, such moments accumulated. Small personal revelations, shared appreciation for a particularly beautiful sunset over the valley, the discovery of common interests that had nothing to do with their practical partnership. Ranch hands, initially wary of how a Boston lady might transform their familiar routines, gradually accepted Harriet's presence. Her cooking, never her strongest skill, but improved by necessity and Maria's guidance, won particular appreciation. Young Tyler, who couldn't be more than 16, despite his insistence he was nearly 20, developed a puppy-like attachment, bringing her wildflowers or interesting rocks he found while riding fence lines. The boy lost his mother young, Matthews explained when he noticed Harriet's bemusement at Tyler's enthusiasm. Ran away from an uncle's farm in Kansas. Mr. Stone found him half-starved in a livery stable in Summit Creek last winter, bringing him back to learn ranching. Gabriel takes in strays, it seems, Harriet observed, then coloured slightly as Matthew's raised eyebrow indicated he might include her in that assessment. Mr. Stone judges people by what they can become, not what circumstances have made them, the foreman replied diplomatically. It served the double bar well over the years. June brought the season's first significant challenge, preparations for driving cattle to market at Granite Junction. The ranch hummed with activity as hands mended tack, organized supplies, and selected which animals would make the 3-day journey to the railroad depot. Gabriel spent longer hours in the saddle, returning later each evening with the weight of responsibility evident in the set of his shoulders. The drive leaves the day after tomorrow, he informed Harriet over a late supper one night, his voice rough with fatigue. Matthews will lead it with 5 of the men. I need to stay behind. There's a potential water rights issue with the Campbell property to the east. Harriet nodded, serving him a second helping of stew without comment on the shadows beneath his eyes. What supplies will the drive need? They'll take the chuck wagon. 3 days there, 2 back if all goes smoothly. He rubbed his forehead where a furrow had formed between his brows. I should be going myself, but this Campbell matter needs attention before it becomes a larger problem. You can't be in 2 places at once, Harriet said practically. Mr. Matthews is clearly capable. The household accounts show he's led drives before. Gabriel looked up, surprise evident in his expression. You've been studying the patterns in the accounts. Of course, how else would I understand the ranch's rhythms? Last June showed similar expenditures, provisions for the drive, extra ammunition, medical supplies. And entries in September indicate fall sales at a slightly higher price per head, suggesting a strategic decision to split the herd between summer and fall markets. For a moment, Gabriel simply stared at her, something unreadable shifting in his eyes. Most women wouldn't take such interest in cattle sales data. Most women haven't had the particular education my father provided, Harriet replied evenly. He believed daughters should understand financial matters as thoroughly as sons. A progressive view. A practical one. My mother died when I was 8. Father saw no reason to shield me from realities I would eventually need to face. Harriet hesitated, then decided to offer something of herself in return for the vulnerabilities Gabriel had revealed in recent weeks. When his health began failing, I managed all his affairs, legal correspondence, household accounts, even negotiations with clients who needed payment terms adjusted. Yet you came west as a mail-order bride. The observation held no judgment, merely curiosity. My father's illness lasted 3 years. His care consumed our savings and then our assets. When he died, I had credentials to teach, but no position. A respectable name, but no means to maintain it. Harriet kept her tone matter-of-fact, though the memories still carried pain. Mr. Patterson's letters offered a fresh start in a place where my circumstances wouldn't be common knowledge. And now you're here instead, managing accounts for cattle you've never seen sold. Life rarely follows the paths we anticipate, Mr. Stone. We adapt or we perish. Harriet rose, gathering their empty bowls. I'll prepare provisions for the drive tomorrow. Harriet. Her given name in his voice stopped her at the kitchen door. Thank you for the meal and for understanding the requirements of the ranch. That simple acknowledgement, recognition of her contribution beyond the expected domestic duties, warmed Harriet more than any practiced compliment could have. She nodded, not trusting her voice with the unexpected emotion that tightened her throat, and continued to the kitchen, where practical tasks would restore her equilibrium. The morning of the cattle drive dawned clear and cool, the ranch awakening. Before first light, with the sounds of final preparations, Harriet had risen early to ensure the men had a substantial breakfast before departure, and to verify that the provisions she'd assembled met Matthew's approval. The foreman inspected the chuck wagon with a critical eye, nodding his satisfaction. "More organized than our usual, Mrs. Stone. The boys will appreciate having more than beans and salt pork by the third day." The name Mrs. Stone still startled Harriet each time she heard it. Their marriage, performed by a justice of the peace, in Summit Creek, the day after her arrival at the ranch, had been a brief procedural affair. She'd worn her navy dress, Gabriel a clean coat that couldn't quite disguise its age. Matthews and Maria had served as witnesses. No rings had been exchanged, no promises beyond the legal minimum required, yet the document filed in the county. Records declared her Harriet Stone, and the hands had adopted the name immediately. "I included extra bandages and liniment," she told Matthews, pushing aside her momentary discomfort. "Young Tyler seems accident-prone." "Born with more enthusiasm than sense," Matthews agreed with gruff affection. "We'll keep him in line." Gabriel appeared from the barn leading his horse, evidently planning to ride out part way with the drive before turning back to deal with the Campbell matter. He paused near Harriet, seeming about to speak, then merely nodded before mounting and giving Matthews the signal to move out. Harriet watched the procession, 6 riders, 200 cattle, and the chuck wagon wind its way out of the ranch yard and up the valley toward Granite Junction. Only when the dust had settled and the last cattle call had faded did she turn back to the house, where a different sort of challenge awaited. With the majority of hands gone and Gabriel occupied with the water rights dispute, Harriet found herself with unexpected autonomy. After completing her usual morning tasks, she decided to tackle a project she'd been contemplating since her arrival, the reorganization of the ranch office. The study, while well-furnished and clearly a space where Gabriel spent considerable time, suffered from a haphazard filing system that made locating specific documents unnecessarily time-consuming. Land deeds, cattle sale records, equipment purchases, and correspondence were intermingled in drawers and cabinets with no discernible logic. By midday, Harriet had emptied every drawer and created categorized stacks across the massive oak desk. By evening, new files labeled in her neat hand filled the cabinets, and a comprehensive index listed where each document type could be found. Satisfied with her progress, she began replacing books that had been removed during the process. It was while reshelving a volume on Colorado water law that Harriet discovered the hidden compartment in the bookcase, a small section where the back panel slid aside to reveal a space just large enough to hold a metal box. Curiosity warring with propriety, she hesitated only briefly before lifting it out and placing it on the desk. The box wasn't locked, suggesting it wasn't meant to be truly secret, but merely private. Inside, Harriet found a collection that painted a picture of Gabriel Stone, more complete than any conversation had yet revealed. A folded Confederate $5 note, a daguerreotype of a much younger Gabriel in Union uniform standing beside. Another soldier with a striking resemblance, letters on feminine stationery tied with faded ribbon, and beneath these a small velvet pouch. The sound of boots on the porch startled Harriet from her exploration. Hastily, she returned the box to its hiding place and resumed shelving books, her heart racing with the knowledge that she had overstepped the careful boundaries of their arrangement. Gabriel entered, looking weary but satisfied. Campbell agreed. "To a joint survey of the boundary line," he announced, then stopped, taking in the transformed study. "You've been busy." "I hope you don't mind," Harriet said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The filing system needed rationalization. There's an index on your desk explaining the new arrangement." Gabriel moved slowly through the room, opening drawers, examining labels, tracing a finger along the neat row of ledgers now arranged chronologically. His expression remained unreadable, and Harriet found herself holding her breath, suddenly uncertain whether her initiative would be welcomed or perceived as intrusion. "You've accomplished in a day what I've intended to do for years," he finally said, turning to face her. "Thank you." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by guilt about the hidden box she'd examined. "I should have asked before making such extensive changes." "It was presumptuous. It was efficient," Gabriel corrected, "and precisely what I needed without realizing it." He glanced at the bookcase, and Harriet couldn't tell if he noticed the slight misalignment of the volumes she'd hastily replaced. "I've been thinking about our arrangement, Harriet." The use of her given name and the serious tone sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. "Yes?" "When Matthews returns with the proceeds from the cattle sale, I'd like to adjust your allowance. The work you're doing goes beyond our original agreement." "That's not necessary." "It is," Gabriel interrupted gently but firmly. "This partnership should benefit us both equally. I'd be paying a ranch manager a substantial salary for less comprehensive work than you're providing." Partnership. The word resonated differently than their previous references to arrangement or agreement. It suggested value beyond the merely transactional recognition of contribution rather than mere fulfillment of obligation. "Thank you," Harriet said simply, accepting both the practical offer and the respect it represented. That night, after Gabriel had retired to his room at the opposite end of the hall, Harriet sat by her window overlooking the moonlit valley. Her thoughts returned to the hidden box and its contents, particularly the velvet pouch she hadn't had time to examine. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would confess her discovery and apologize for the invasion of privacy. Their partnership, still new and fragile, deserved the foundation of honesty that Theodore Patterson had denied her. What she couldn't know as she finally sought her bed was that the Campbell water dispute was merely the harbinger of greater challenges to come, conflicts that would test not just her adaptability, but the very nature of the unusual bond forming between a woman abandoned by false promises and a man whose scars had taught him to expect rejection as his natural due. Morning arrived, with the sound of hoofbeats in the ranch yard, a single rider approaching at speed that suggested urgency rather than leisure. Harriet, already dressed and preparing breakfast, moved to the window in time to see Martinez dismounting from a lathered horse, calling for Gabriel. Her husband appeared from the barn, tools in hand suggesting he'd been working since dawn. The two men spoke in rapid exchanges, Martinez gesturing toward the eastern ridge while Gabriel's posture grew increasingly tense. Within moments, Gabriel strode toward the house, his expression grim. "Campbell's men are diverting the creek," he announced, as he entered, reaching for his gun belt hanging by the door. "They've built a dam overnight that's cutting off our water supply to the north pasture." Harriet set down the coffee pot she'd been holding. "But you said he agreed to a survey of the boundary line." "Apparently he's decided to establish possession, rather than wait for legal determination." Gabriel checked his revolver methodically. "I need to ride out there immediately." "Surely this is a matter for the sheriff." "Sheriff Donovan's jurisdiction doesn't extend this far effectively. By the time he arrived, the damage would be done." Gabriel's voice was controlled but tight with urgency. "With most of our hands at the cattle drive, Campbell's chosen his moment well." The implication was clear. This was no spontaneous action, but a calculated move, taking advantage of the double bar's temporarily reduced manpower. "How many men does Campbell have?" Harriet asked, practical concerns overriding abstract questions of legality. Martinez counted 5 at the dam site. There could be more. Gabriel hesitated, then made a decision. "If we're not back by nightfall, secure the house and take my rifle from the study. It's unlikely they'd approach the main buildings, but I understand." Harriet's voice was steadier than she felt. "What supplies do you need?" Relief flickered across Gabriel's face, gratitude for her composure rather than hysterics or demands for reassurance. Together they quickly assembled provisions, medical supplies, and ammunition. Within 20 minutes, Gabriel and Martinez rode out, leaving Harriet with young Cooper and Williams to manage the essential ranch operations and maintain a watchful presence. The day stretched interminably. Harriet kept herself busy with necessary tasks, tending the kitchen garden, preparing food should the men return hungry, reviewing the documents related to water rights that she'd organized in the study. The legal language confirmed what Gabriel had told her. The creek had been part of Double Bar's water claim since the ranch's establishment, with Campbell's more recent claim limited to a downstream portion. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley, Harriet found herself repeatedly checking the eastern ridge for signs of returning riders. Cooper and Williams maintained their own vigilance, alternating patrols of the property while keeping rifles within reach. Mrs. Stone? Williams appeared at the kitchen door as Harriet was preparing a stew that could simmer indefinitely until needed. "Rider coming, just one from the east." Harriet's heart stuttered. One rider, not two. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed Williams onto the porch, shading her eyes against the lowering sun. The approaching horseman rode slumped in. The saddle, Gabriel, she realized, with a surge of relief followed immediately by concern at his posture. Cooper rushed forward as Gabriel's horse entered the yard, reaching up to help him dismount. Even from the porch, Harriet could see the dark stains spreading across Gabriel's left shoulder, the unnatural pallor of his face as he leaned heavily on Cooper for support. "Get him inside," she directed, already turning back to gather medical supplies. "Williams, heat water and bring it to the study. Where's Martinez?" "Staying to watch the dam," Gabriel managed as Cooper helped him through the door. Campbell's men pulled back after the initial confrontation. The study couch became an impromptu examination table, Gabriel's bloodied shirt cut away to reveal a bullet wound high in his left shoulder. Harriet assessed the damage with outward calm that belied her racing thoughts. The bullet appeared to have passed through cleanly, but blood loss and risk of infection remained serious concerns. "I need better light," she said to Cooper. "Bring that lamp closer." Gabriel watched her preparations through pain-hazed eyes. "You've done this before." "My father's law practice occasionally involved unsavory characters," Harriet replied, carefully cleansing the wound. "I learned rudimentary medical care by necessity. This will hurt considerably." She worked methodically, irrigating the wound with carbolic solution, applying pressure to slow the bleeding, preparing bandages from clean linen. Gabriel endured her ministrations in stoic silence, broken only by an occasional sharp intake of breath. When pain overcame willpower, "Campbell's men fired first," he said, as she began bandaging his shoulder. "We approached under white flag to discuss the situation. Someone got nervous or had orders. Martinez wasn't hit." "That can wait until you're stabilized," Harriet replied, concentrating on securing the bandage firmly without restricting circulation. "You need laudanum for the pain and then rest." Gabriel shook his head. "No laudanum. Need to keep my wits. Campbell might interpret my injury as weakness, try to press his advantage. You'll be of no use to the ranch if fever sets in because you're too stubborn to rest properly," Harriet countered, her concern manifesting as brisk efficiency. "Cooper and Williams are capable men, and Martinez is watching the situation." Something in her tone, authority born of genuine care rather than mere stubbornness, seemed to reach him. Gabriel submitted to a small dose of laudanum and allowed himself to be settled in his bedroom, rather than returning immediately to the study to formulate plans. Harriet supervised this transfer, arranged pillows to elevate the wounded shoulder, and placed water within easy reach. Only when she was certain Gabriel was as comfortable as circumstances allowed did she permit her composure to waver, her hands trembling slightly as she straightened linens that needed no adjustment. "Thank you," Gabriel said quietly, observing her with clearer eyes than she'd expected, given his injury and medication. Not every Boston lady would handle a gunshot wound with such capability. "I'm no longer a Boston lady," Harriet replied, surprising herself with the realization that this was true in more than mere geography. "I'm the wife of a Colorado rancher, apparently." The statement hung between them, acknowledging the shift that had occurred without either consciously noting its progression, from arrangement of convenience to something more substantial, with responsibilities and concerns that transcended their original agreement. "Harriet." Gabriel's voice had softened, whether from laudanum or some deeper emotion she couldn't determine. "In my study behind the water law books, there's a box—" "I know," she interrupted, guilt prompting honesty. "I found it yesterday while reorganizing. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. I intended to tell you." She expected anger, or at least disappointment, but Gabriel merely nodded as if her discovery was unsurprising. "The velvet pouch contains my mother's wedding ring. I want you to have it." Harriet stared at him, momentarily speechless. "But our arrangement has become more than either of us anticipated." His grey-blue eyes held hers steadily despite pain and encroaching medication-induced drowsiness. "You deserve the recognition of a true wife, Harriet, not merely a housekeeper with a convenient title." "You're injured and medicated," she said carefully, uncertain how to interpret this unexpected development. "We should discuss this when you're recovered." Gabriel's eyes were already closing, the laudanum finally overcoming his resistance. "The ring is yours regardless. You've earned it through actions, not empty promises." After he drifted into uneasy sleep, Harriet remained by his bedside, her thoughts tumultuous. The contrast between Theodore Patterson's flowery letters followed by abandonment and Gabriel Stone's plain speech, backed by consistent respect, created a comparison she could no longer ignore. One had offered pretty words that dissolved at the first test. The other demonstrated character through actions that spoke more eloquently than any practiced sentiment. The following days established a new rhythm at the double bar. Gabriel's wound, while serious, began healing without signs of infection, a fortunate outcome Harriet attributed to prompt cleaning and his naturally robust constitution. Though confined initially to bed and then to limited movement around the house, Gabriel maintained control of ranch operations through regular consultations with Cooper and Williams. Martinez reported that Campbell's men maintained a presence at the disputed dam, but had made no further aggressive moves. The impasse would hold until Matthews returned with the additional hands from the cattle drive, restoring the double bar's ability to protect its interests through strength if legal means proved insufficient. Harriet found herself in an expanded role that encompassed nurse, ranch manager's assistant, and keeper of morale for the depleted crew. She moved between these responsibilities with growing confidence, discovering capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, and a resilience born of necessity rather than abstract principle. In the quiet evenings, as Gabriel gradually regained strength, they developed a new habit, sharing the events of the day in the study, where he could access ranch records while resting his injured shoulder. These conversations, beginning with practical matters, inevitably expanded to include personal histories, opinions on books they'd both read, and occasionally philosophical discussions that revealed the depth behind Gabriel's often taciturn exterior. "You mentioned your father was an attorney," Gabriel said one evening, as Harriet reviewed supply needs for the coming week. "Did you never consider marriage in Boston before circumstances forced your decision?" The personal question, unusual in its directness, gave Harriet pause. "There was a possibility once. Professor Aldridge at the ladies' seminary, where I taught briefly after father fell ill. He was widowed, respected, financially secure. Yet you didn't accept him." Harriet set down her pencil, considering how to explain a decision she'd rarely articulated even to herself. He wanted an ornamental wife to advance his social position, someone to pour tea for faculty wives and never express opinions that might contradict his. When my father's illness worsened and required my full attention, Professor Aldridge made it clear that such filial devotion would be incompatible with the duties he expected from a wife. "He sounds like a fool," Gabriel observed mildly. The unexpected support warmed Harriet more than the fire crackling in the hearth. Society didn't think so. Caring for an invalid father rather than securing my future through an advantageous marriage was considered impractical at best, foolishly sentimental at worst. Society often confuses practicality with selfishness. Gabriel shifted slightly, wincing as the movement jarred his shoulder. True practicality recognizes that loyalty and compassion have tangible value beyond immediate convenience. The insight revealed aspects of Gabriel's character that explained much about the double bar. His loyalty to hands like young Tyler, who needed second chances, his fair dealings with Martinez's family, whose land claims predated American settlement, his patience with Harriet's adjustment to ranch life despite his own discomfort during recovery. "May I ask about your brother?" Harriet ventured, referring to the daguerreotype she'd seen in the hidden box. The family resemblance was striking. If the question overstepped, Gabriel gave no indication. "Thomas was 2 years younger. We enlisted together in '62, fought in the same regiment until Gettysburg, where he was killed, leading a charge against Confederate artillery." His voice remained even, the old grief weathered by time into something he could carry without being crushed by its weight. "And the Confederate note in your box, taken from the body of the young rebel who fired the shell at the Wilderness." Gabriel's hand moved unconsciously toward his scarred cheek. "I wanted to hate him, but he couldn't have been more than 17. Just another boy caught in a war started by old men's ambitions." The complexity of this sentiment, carrying a memento from the very person who had caused his disfigurement, finding humanity in an enemy rather than nurturing hatred, revealed depths to Gabriel that transcended the simple narrative of a battle-scarred rancher seeking practical household management. Their conversations continued in this vein as Gabriel's recovery progressed, weaving a connection neither had anticipated when forming their arrangement. The velvet pouch remained unmentioned, though Harriet often found her thoughts returning to it and the significance of Gabriel's offer. Had it been merely laudanum-induced sentimentality or something more substantial? Her answer came unexpectedly. On the 8th day after the shooting, when Matthews and the hands returned from the cattle drive, the foreman reported a successful sale. Prices higher than anticipated, all cattle delivered without significant loss. The ranch yard bustled with activity as men resumed normal operations. Supplies were unloaded and an atmosphere of restoration settled over the double bar. That evening, after the returned hands had been updated on the Campbell situation and plans made for addressing the water dispute from a position of renewed strength, Gabriel asked Harriet to join him for a private conversation in the study. His improved health was evident in his straighter posture and the natural color returning to his face, though he still favored his injured shoulder. "The cattle drive proceeds will allow significant improvements to the ranch," he began, standing by the window rather than taking his usual chair. "Matthews brought mail from town, including the surveyor's official report on our boundary with Campbell's property. It confirms our water rights exactly as our deed indicates." "That's excellent news," Harriet replied, sensing there was more to this conversation than financial and legal updates. Gabriel turned from the window to face her directly. "I've been considering our situation, Harriet. These past weeks have shown me that our arrangement, as originally conceived, no longer accurately reflects what has developed between us." Uncertainty fluttered in Harriet's chest. Was he planning to dissolve their agreement now that she had proven herself capable of earning a position elsewhere? Had she misinterpreted the growing ease and intimacy of their interactions? When I proposed our marriage of convenience, I offered you security and respect in exchange for managing my household, Gabriel continued, moving closer until he stood directly before her. I believed that was all either of us required or desired from this arrangement. It was a fair agreement, Harriet said carefully, unable to read his intentions. Fair, perhaps, but increasingly insufficient. From his pocket, Gabriel withdrew the velvet pouch she recognized from the hidden box. My mother wore this ring for 32 years. My father gave it to her when they had nothing but a land claim and dreams of building something lasting together. He opened the pouch, revealing a simple gold band set with a small but flawless diamond that caught the evening light. I'm not asking to change the practical aspects of our arrangement, Harriet. You'll always have your independence, your own space, your freedom to make choices without constraint. But I would like to offer something beyond practicality, if you're willing to consider it. What exactly are you proposing, Gabriel? Harriet asked, her voice steadier than her racing pulse would suggest. A true partnership, not merely one of convenience, the possibility of building something together that neither of us could create alone. He held the ring between them, not yet offering it directly. I don't speak of romantic sentiments, we're both too practical for such indulgences, but of genuine regard based on demonstrated character rather than false promises or social expectations. The contrast with Theodore Patterson's abandonment couldn't have been more pronounced. Where Patterson had offered flowery words without substance, Gabriel offered substance without embellishment. Where one had seen her only as a useful accessory to his plans, the other recognized her as an equal contributor to shared endeavors. This injury has shown me what you perhaps already understood, Gabriel continued, when Harriet remained silent. Life in these mountains demands more than practical arrangements. It requires trust, loyalty, and genuine care, qualities you've demonstrated not because our agreement demanded them, but because they're intrinsic to your nature. Harriet found herself at a crossroads more significant than the one she'd faced. In Summit Creek, then necessity had driven her decision to accept Gabriel's proposition. Now, with experience and growing emotional attachment informing her choice, the decision carried greater weight precisely because it wasn't forced by circumstance, but offered freely. I've learned something as well, she finally said, meeting his steady gaze. In Boston, I believed security meant proper appearances, social position, and financial stability. Here I've discovered that true security comes from character proven through actions, reliability when tested, honesty when convenient lies would be easier, respect demonstrated rather than merely promised. She extended her hand, not toward the ring, but to touch the scarred side of Gabriel's face with gentle fingers. It was the first time either had initiated such contact, crossing the careful physical boundaries established in their original arrangement. Beneath her touch, Gabriel remained perfectly still, vulnerability evident in his eyes, despite his otherwise controlled expression. Yes, Harriet said simply, to a true partnership, to possibilities beyond practical arrangements. Gabriel took her hand from his cheek and gently slipped his mother's ring onto her finger. The simple action carried weight beyond ceremony, an acknowledgement of changed circumstances, evolved feelings, and a future neither had envisioned when they first met in the Summit Creek Hotel. What neither could anticipate as they stood in the study with mountain twilight settling over the double bar was how soon their newfound partnership would be tested. Campbell's water dispute represented only the beginning of challenges that would demand every measure of the trust and loyalty they had just affirmed. But with the ring now resting on Harriet's finger, not as a symbol of ownership, but of genuine partnership. They faced these coming trials from a foundation stronger than either had possessed alone. July brought scorching heat to the valley, the kind that shimmered above the grasslands and turned the creek to a lazy ribbon of water that required careful management to sustain both cattle and crops. Gabriel's shoulder had healed enough for limited work, though Harriet noticed he still favored his right arm for heavier tasks. The confrontation with Campbell had settled into an uneasy truce. The survey results officially filed with the county recorder, the makeshift dam partially dismantled, but tensions simmering beneath surface. Civility! Campbell won't let this end with paperwork, Matthews predicted one evening as he, Gabriel and Harriet reviewed ranch operations on the front porch, taking advantage of rare evening breezes. Men like that don't accept defeat, just regroup for the next attempt. Which is why we're doubling patrols along the eastern boundary, Gabriel replied, studying the property map spread across his knees, and why I've written to the territorial governor about establishing clearer enforcement mechanisms for water rights disputes. Harriet listened to their discussion while completing her own task, mending one of Gabriel's shirts with neat, even stitches that disguised the bullet hole that had punctured both fabric and flesh. The ring on her finger caught the last rays of sunset, a constant reminder of the evolution their relationship had undergone since her arrival at the Double Bar. Martinez mentioned seeing strangers near the North Ridge yesterday, Matthews continued. Not Campbell's usual hands, city men by their look. Gabriel's expression sharpened with interest. Did they approach our property? Kept to public land, but they were studying the valley with field glasses. Martinez thought they might be surveyors of some kind. Or mining company representatives, Gabriel suggested. There have been rumors about silver deposits in the mountains, northeast of here since spring. The conversation shifted to cattle matters, which yearlings showed the most promise, how the new breeding bull was performing, preparations for the fall drive. But Harriet noticed Gabriel's attention repeatedly returning to the North Ridge marked on the map, his expression thoughtful and slightly concerned. Later, as they prepared for bed in their separate rooms, the original boundaries of their arrangement maintained despite the deepening of their relationship. Harriet heard Gabriel's uneven step pause outside her door, followed by a gentle knock. "Come in," she called, setting aside the book she'd been reading. Gabriel entered, still dressed though he'd removed his boots. "I'm riding to Summit Creek tomorrow," he announced without preamble. "Those strangers Matthews mentioned trouble me. I want to hear whatever news or rumors are circulating in town." "Would you like me to accompany you?" Harriet offered. "I could use the opportunity to replenish some household supplies we're running low on." Gabriel appeared to consider this, weighing practical benefits against potential risks. "The ride is long, and the town can be rough during the mining season, but having you along would make my inquiries less conspicuous." He nodded, decision made. "We'll leave at first light, stay overnight if necessary." The journey to Summit Creek the following day revealed a relationship transformed by shared purpose and growing trust. Where their initial trip from town to the Double Bar had been marked by cautious formality, this ride featured conversation that flowed naturally between ranch matters, observations about the landscape they passed, and occasional personal revelations offered without the awkward hesitation of their early acquaintance. "Elizabeth writes that Denver grows more sophisticated by the month," Gabriel remarked, as they crossed a meadow brilliant with wildflowers. Opera houses, French restaurants, ladies' tea rooms. Hard to reconcile with the mining camp it was when I first came through after the war. "Do you miss city amenities?" Harriet asked, genuinely curious about what had drawn this educated man to such isolated existence. Gabriel considered the question seriously, as he did all her inquiries. Not the amenities themselves, so much as the anonymity they permitted. His hand unconsciously touched his scarred cheek. "In Denver, I was one of many damaged veterans. Here, I'm a curiosity, especially to newcomers who haven't grown accustomed to—" He gestured vaguely toward his face. "People can be thoughtlessly cruel," Harriet agreed, thinking of the stares that had followed them through town during their brief marriage ceremony, or deliberately so. "After I was wounded, the daughter of a family friend visited the hospital in Washington. She'd written cheerful letters throughout my deployment, promising to wait faithfully." A muscle tightened in his jaw at the memory. When she saw what the shell had done, she couldn't mask her revulsion quickly enough. 2 weeks later, I received a gentle letter explaining that perhaps we should reconsider our understanding, given my changed circumstances. The pain of that rejection still echoed in his voice, though clearly diminished by time and perspective. Harriet found herself unexpectedly angry on his behalf, not just at the young woman's broken promises, but at a society that valued unblemished appearances over proven character. "Her loss," Harriet said simply, "though I suppose I should be," grateful for her short-sightedness, as it eventually led to our arrangement. Gabriel glanced at her, surprise giving way to appreciation for her practical framing of past disappointments. "As I should be grateful that Theodore Patterson revealed his true character before you were legally bound to him." The mention of Patterson no longer stung as it once had. Harriet had come to recognize that his abandonment, painful though it had been, had redirected her path toward something more substantial than the hollow security he had promised. Summit. Greek had grown noticeably in the months since Harriet had arrived as an abandoned bride. New buildings lined the main street, the distinct sound of multiple hammers suggesting further expansion in progress. Most telling was the increased traffic, freight wagons laden with supplies, prospectors with mules carrying equipment, and the inevitable camp followers drawn by rumors of new mineral discoveries. Silver Strike in the North Mountains, the livery. Stable owner confirmed, as Gabriel arranged stabling for their horses. 50 miles northeast, they say. Not a bonanza like Leadville, but enough to draw every drifter and dreamer between here and Kansas City. Gabriel and Harriet exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of this news in relation to the strangers observed near Double Bar Land. After securing rooms at the hotel, separate accommodations that acknowledged both propriety and the still-evolving nature of their relationship, they divided tasks with efficient partnership. Gabriel would visit the land office and speak with Sheriff Donovan about mining activities, while Harriet would handle purchasing supplies and perhaps glean information from the mercantile owner's wife, known for her comprehensive knowledge of local gossip. "Meet at the hotel dining room at 6, Gabriel suggested. "By then we should have a clearer picture of what's developing." Mrs. Bailey at the mercantile proved as informative as anticipated, requiring minimal prompting to share the latest developments. While measuring fabric for new curtains, Harriet had decided the ranch house windows needed. "Consolidated Western Mining bought 3 claims last month," she reported, expertly cutting calico. "Their men have been all over the county, offering cash for properties that might have mineral potential. Even approached the Wilsons about their homestead, and that land wouldn't yield a thimbleful of silver to a ton of rock." "Have they expressed interest in ranch properties?" Harriet asked, selecting thread to match her purchases. "Only those in the northern foothills." Mrs. Bailey leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Though Mr. Campbell was seen dining with their representatives at the hotel last week, quite friendly for a man who normally takes his meals alone." This information, seemingly casual, but potentially significant, occupied Harriet's thoughts as she completed her errands. Campbell's water rights dispute with the Double Bar took on new dimensions when considered alongside possible mining interests. Water was essential for ore processing, perhaps more valuable in the long term than whatever meager grazing his property provided. By the time Harriet joined Gabriel in the hotel dining room, she had compiled several pieces of intelligence that, while individually merely interesting, collectively suggested a pattern worth attention. Gabriel, she discovered, had reached similar conclusions through his own inquiries. The land office has recorded 17 new mining claims in the past month, he informed her quietly as they studied their menus, all within 20 miles of our northern boundary. And Sheriff Donovan mentioned that Campbell has hired 3 new hands, former miners with reputations for settling disputes with fists rather than words. Mrs. Bailey says Campbell has been meeting with consolidated Western representatives, Harriet added. Do you think he's selling his ranch or partnering with them for something else? Gabriel's expression was troubled. Donovan also mentioned the Consolidated Western has been acquiring water rights throughout the territory, purchasing, leasing, whatever arrangements current owners will accept. The implications crystallized between them without need for explicit statement. The Double Bars Creek, which Campbell had attempted to divert, represented not just irrigation for cattle, but a potential resource for mining operations. Their recent boundary dispute might have been merely a preliminary skirmish in a larger campaign. We should return to the ranch earlier than planned, Gabriel decided. I want all hands to be alert to unusual activities, especially near the water sources. They retired to their separate rooms that night, with a shared sense of looming conflict, though its exact form remained undefined. Harriet found sleep elusive, her mind cataloguing potential threats and countermeasures with the same methodical approach she'd once applied to her father's legal cases. When a soft knock sounded on her door, shortly after midnight, she was already reaching for her robe, somehow unsurprised by the nocturnal interruption. Gabriel stood in the hallway, fully dressed despite the hour, his expression taut with controlled urgency. Martinez just arrived from the ranch, he said without preamble. There's been an incident at the north pasture. Someone cut the fence and scattered the cattle. While the hands were occupied rounding them up, the storage barn was set ablaze. Harriet grasped the implications immediately. A diversion. Precisely. Fortunately, they contained the fire before it spread to other buildings. But we lost feed and equipment. Gabriel's hand clenched at his side. Martinez rode through the night to reach us. We need to return immediately. I'll be ready in 10 minutes, Harriet promised, already mentally prioritizing which supplies to take and which could wait for a future trip. They rode out of Summit Creek as false dawn was breaking, the streets still quiet except for a few early workers and night owls staggering home from saloons. Martinez accompanied them, his exhaustion evident, but determination unwavering as they pushed their mounts at a pace that balanced urgency with the horses' endurance. Was anyone injured? Harriet asked as they forded a stream about halfway to the ranch. No, ma'am, Martinez replied. Young Tyler spotted the fence cut before any cattle strayed too far. The fire started while most hands were still gathering strays. Deliberate timing, Gabriel observed grimly. They knew our routine struck when we'd be most vulnerable. Cooper found boot prints by the barn, Martinez added. 2 men, neither wearing our hands issue. One had a distinctive heel pattern, like it had been repaired with a metal plate. This detail, seemingly minor, caused Gabriel to pull his horse up sharply. A metal heel plate? You're certain? Martinez nodded. Unusual enough that Cooper made. A sketch of the pattern. What is it? Harriet asked, noting Gabriel's intense reaction. Jack Reeves wears custom boots with metal plates, Gabriel explained. Former Union cavalry, now Campbell's foreman. I'd recognize his trail anywhere from hunting expeditions before our disagreements. So Campbell is directly responsible, Harriet concluded, or wants us to believe he is. Gabriel urged his horse forward again. Either way, this changes our response. Random vandalism could be addressed quietly. A deliberate attack by a neighboring rancher requires more formal measures. The double bar came into view around midday, the charred remains of the storage barn, a stark black scar against the property's otherwise orderly appearance. The hands had clearly worked through the night, cattle back in appropriate pastures, makeshift security arranged around remaining structures, water barrels positioned strategically in case of further fire attempts. News of their return spread quickly, bringing Matthews and Cooper to the main house as Gabriel helped Harriet dismount before the front porch. The foreman's expression confirmed that the situation remained tense but stable. "No further incidents since Martinez left," Matthews reported. "We've doubled the night watch and moved the most valuable equipment into the main barn where it can be better protected." "Any witnesses to the actual fire setting?" Gabriel asked, his tone suggesting he already anticipated the answer. "None that saw faces," Cooper replied. Tyler thought he glimpsed movement near the barn just before the flames appeared, but he was focused on the scattered cattle. Inside, Harriet quickly organized the supplies they'd brought while listening to the men discuss security arrangements and potential responses. The conversation had the measured cadence of experienced hands evaluating threats, not panicking, but not underestimating the seriousness of deliberate property destruction. Sheriff Donovan should be notified, Gabriel decided. Whether Campbell is directly responsible or Consolidated Western is testing our resolve before making an offer, official documentation of the incident is essential. "And if they try again?" Matthews asked the question that hung in everyone's thoughts. "We defend what's ours," Gabriel stated simply. "Legally if possible, by other means if necessary." The double bar wasn't built by yielding to pressure regardless of its source. After the men departed to implement enhanced security measures, Harriet found herself alone with Gabriel in the study that had become the center of their shared enterprise. The strain of rapid travel and mounting concerns showed in the tightness around his eyes, the careful way he held his still-healing shoulder. "You should rest," she suggested. "Even a few hours would help your recovery." "There's too much to address," Gabriel replied, though he sank into his desk chair with evident weariness. "We need to inventory what was lost, reorganize the hands, schedules to maintain both operations and security, draft letters to both the sheriff and the territorial governor. All of which will be accomplished more effectively after you've rested," Harriet countered. "I can begin the inventory and drafts. Matthews has the security well in hand." Gabriel studied her with an expression that mingled appreciation and something deeper, less easily defined. "When you arrived at the double bar, did you ever imagine becoming involved in water rights disputes and potential range wars?" "I imagined becoming a respectable rancher's wife," Harriet replied with deliberate lightness, "which apparently includes such matters. This isn't what you agreed to when you accepted my proposition." Gabriel's tone had shifted to seriousness. "Managing a household is one thing. Facing property destruction and possible physical danger is entirely another." Harriet recognized the unspoken offer in his words, a chance to withdraw from increasing risks, to seek the security she had originally desired in less contested circumstances. The Gabriel Stone, who had proposed their arrangement of convenience, would have considered this the honorable course. The partner she had come to know deserved a more honest response. "I agreed to a marriage of convenience with a man who offered respect and security in exchange for competent household management," she said, moving to stand beside his chair. "What has developed since then transcends that initial agreement, as we both acknowledged in Summit Creek." Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease that had evolved between them. "The challenges facing the double bar are now my challenges as well, not because our arrangement requires it, but because that's what true partnership means." Gabriel's expression softened, the habitual guardedness giving way to open vulnerability, rarely displayed even in their private moments. "You could return to Summit Creek until this situation resolves. No one would think less of you for choosing safety." "I would think less of myself," Harriet replied simply. "And you would worry about my safety in town rather than focusing on What needs to be done here? Neither serves our interests. The logic of her position was irrefutable, but Harriet knew it wasn't reason alone that prompted Gabriel to raise their joined hands to his lips in a gesture of profound gratitude and respect. What had begun as a practical arrangement had transformed through shared challenges into something neither had anticipated, genuine partnership based on proven character rather than romantic illusions or social expectations. "Rest," she insisted. "Again. I'll wake you if anything requires immediate attention." This time, Gabriel acquiesced, recognizing that true strength sometimes lay in accepting support rather than maintaining self-sufficient isolation. As he made his way toward the master bedroom, Harriet turned her attention to the practical tasks at hand: cataloging losses, drafting correspondence, organizing household adjustments to accommodate heightened security needs. The woman who had arrived at the double bar, seeking simply to avoid destitution, now found herself an essential element in its defense. Theodore Patterson's abandonment, once the deepest disappointment of her life, had redirected her path toward challenges more significant than managing a mercantile, partnerships more substantial than any she might have formed in Summit Creek. What Harriet couldn't yet know, as she meticulously documented the attacked barn's contents, was that the incident represented merely the opening move in a strategic campaign against the double bar, one that would test not only the practical partnership she and Gabriel had established, but the deeper bonds forming beneath its surface. The coming weeks would demand every measure of the trust they had built, every ounce of the resilience they had individually developed through past disappointments. Yet, as she worked at the desk where Gabriel had offered his mother's ring and a true partnership, Harriet felt not fear, but a steely determination she barely recognized as her own. The Boston schoolteacher who had arrived in Colorado seeking security had discovered something more valuable in these mountains: her own capacity for courage. When everything she valued faced genuine threat, August brought relentless heat and a disturbing pattern of escalation. 3 weeks after the barn burning, the double bar had endured 2 more strategic attacks, fences cut in different locations, forcing exhausting roundups of scattered cattle, and a mysterious illness that struck 6 head of prime breeding stock, resulting in 2 deaths before the ranch's hasty preventative measures protected the remainder of the herd. Sheriff Donovan had visited, documenting incidents and promising increased patrols, but the vast territory and limited manpower rendered his assurances largely symbolic. Gabriel's letters to the territorial governor had received polite acknowledgments without concrete assistance. The double bar, it seemed, would need to rely on its own resources to weather the calculated campaign against it. "It's the water they're after," Gabriel explained one evening as the ranch's core leadership, Gabriel, Harriet, Matthews, and Martinez, gathered around the dining table where maps and documents had replaced dinner plates. "Campbell's property alone doesn't have enough for substantial mining operations. Combined with our creek and water rights, it becomes viable for large-scale processing. But surely there are easier targets," Harriet observed, studying the regional map where Gabriel had marked known mining claims with red pencil. "Other ranches with fewer hands or less established operations? None with our particular combination of water resources and access routes," Matthews pointed out. "The double bar sits at a natural junction point between the mountains and the rail line at Granite Junction, and none with previous boundary disputes that provide convenient cover for acquisition attempts," Gabriel added. "Campbell's water rights challenge gives Consolidated Western plausible deniability for these incidents." The strategy was becoming clear: weaken the double bar through systematic harassment, create economic hardship through property damage and livestock losses, then offer purchase as a seemingly generous solution to mounting problems. It was a familiar pattern in territories where mining interests sought to expand. though usually directed at smaller operations with fewer resources to resist. "What's our counter-strategy?" Harriet asked, her practical nature focusing on solutions, rather than continued analysis of the problem. Gabriel exchanged glances with Matthews, a wordless communication born of years working together. "Defense, documentation and diversification. We've strengthened security measures to minimize further losses. We're documenting every incident for potential legal action, and we're accelerating plans to diversify ranch operations beyond cattle." This last element was new information to Harriet. "Diversify how?" "The North Pasture has excellent soil for growing hay," Gabriel explained. "We've always produced enough for our own needs, but with additional investment, we could supply other ranches and the mining operations themselves. Martinez has experience with irrigation systems that could double or triple yield. And the southeast quarter near the creek bend would support fruit trees," Martinez added. "My grandfather grew apples and pears there before this was American territory. The climate in that protected pocket is suitable." Harriet considered these possibilities with growing interest. Fresh fruit would command premium prices in mining camps, and proper orchards would strengthen our water rights claims. Established agriculture versus speculative mining. "Exactly," Gabriel confirmed, approval evident in his expression. "We've been primarily a cattle operation because that's what I knew from military procurement experience, but the double bar's potential is more diverse. These initiatives require capital investment," Matthews cautioned, "money that would normally go toward expanding the herd or improving breeding stock." "I've considered that," Gabriel acknowledged. "Elizabeth's husband has connections with Denver banks. He's arranged a meeting next week to discuss financing options." The conversation continued into the night, transitioning from defensive tactics to forward-looking strategies. Harriet contributed insights from her father's business experiences, suggesting methods to structure potential loans that protected the ranch's core assets while enabling necessary expansion. Gabriel built upon these ideas, his natural strategic thinking now focused on business development rather than merely security concerns. As the meeting concluded and Matthews and Martinez departed to implement immediate security measures, Harriet found herself unexpectedly energized despite the late hour and serious circumstances. The challenges facing the double bar were undeniably dangerous, yet the collaborative planning session had revealed possibilities that transcended mere survival. "You're smiling," Gabriel observed as they gathered the maps and documents. "An unusual response to potential range war and financial reorganization." "I'm thinking about transformation," Harriet replied, surprising herself with the insight that emerged as she spoke. "How pressure creates possibility. Without Campbell's aggression and consolidated Weston's interest, we might never have examined the ranch's full potential beyond cattle." Gabriel considered this perspective. "My father had a similar philosophy. Never waste a crisis," he would say. "It clears away comfortable habits that prevent necessary growth." "A wisdom that applies beyond ranching," Harriet noted, thinking of how her own crisis, abandonment in Summit Creek, had led to unforeseen possibilities rather than the disaster it had initially appeared. Gabriel's expression softened as he seemed to follow her unspoken thought. "I've been meaning to ask you something, Harriet, something unrelated to our current challenges." "Yes?" "The harvest dance in Summit Creek is next weekend. In previous years, I've had convenient excuses to avoid such gatherings. But as my wife, in whatever capacity we define that, you might enjoy the social occasion." He spoke carefully, as if navigating unfamiliar terrain. "I wouldn't be the most comfortable companion at such an event, but I wouldn't want to deprive you of normal social experiences." The invitation represented a significant departure from Gabriel's established patterns. His scarred face made him avoid social gatherings, particularly celebratory events, where his appearance created uncomfortable contrasts with festive atmospheres. That he would consider attending the harvest dance, one of Summit Creek's major annual events, solely for her benefit, touched Harriet deeply. "I would enjoy attending," she replied with equal care, "but only if you would genuinely consider it. As well, not merely tolerate it for my sake. I find I'm less concerned about public appearances than I once was," Gabriel admitted. "Recent events have provided perspective on what matters and what doesn't." This simple statement conveyed volumes about his personal evolution, from a man who had retreated from society because of his scars to one willing to face potential discomfort for shared experiences that mattered. Harriet recognized this small but significant offering as another dimension of the partnership that continued to develop between them. "Then I would be honored to attend the harvest dance with my husband," she said, the designation feeling increasingly natural despite their unconventional arrangement. The week leading to the dance brought intense activity on multiple fronts. Security measures were reinforced, with hands rotating through guard duties that maintained vigilance without exhausting limited manpower. Martinez began surveying the north pasture for irrigation possibilities, marking potential ditches and water control points. Gabriel drafted detailed proposals for bank consideration, consulting frequently with Harriet about financial projections and risk assessments. Throughout these pragmatic activities, a subtle undercurrent of anticipation developed around the upcoming social event. Harriet devoted early mornings to refreshing her best dress, a deep blue woolen that had traveled from Boston but never been worn in Colorado. Gabriel arranged for the ranch's rarely used buggy to be reconditioned for the journey, its leather seats cleaned and springs checked for the rough road to town. These preparations occurred alongside continued vigilance, creating a strange juxtaposition of normalcy and caution. Armed men accompanied routine activities. Matthews devised coded signals for emergencies, and no one traveled the property alone. Yet within these security measures, daily life continued, and plans for a social outing progressed. A defiant normalcy, in the face of deliberate intimidation. The morning of the harvest dance dawned clear and unseasonably cool, hinting at the approaching fall. Harriet woke early, finishing household preparations before attending to her personal appearance with greater care than her usual practical grooming. She arranged her chestnut hair in a style more elaborate than her everyday simplicity, secured with her mother's tortoiseshell combs. The blue dress, when donned, reminded her of another life in Boston drawing rooms, though the woman wearing it now bore little resemblance to the one who had originally purchased it. Gabriel appeared at breakfast, in his good black coat, freshly trimmed hair revealing more of his scarred face than he typically allowed. The vulnerability inherent in this choice, refusing to hide behind the longer hair that usually shadowed his damaged features, spoke to a courage that had nothing to do with physical confrontation and everything to do with internal battles. "Oh, one, you look beautiful," he said simply as Harriet entered the dining room. "And you look very handsome," she replied with equal sincerity, noting how the formal attire emphasized his natural dignity and the strength evident in his posture. Their journey to Summit Creek passed pleasantly, conversation flowing naturally, between observations about the landscape's transition toward autumn and discussions of the upcoming bank meeting in Denver. The buggy, while less practical than horseback for daily ranch activities, offered a civilized comfort appropriate for the occasion and safety in numbers, as Martinez and Cooper rode alongside as both escort and protection against potential interference. Summit Creek had transformed for the harvest celebration. Bunting decorated the main street buildings, stalls offered food and crafts from surrounding farms, and the cleared lot beside the hotel had been converted to a dance floor with lanterns strung overhead for the evening's festivities. The town bustled with visitors from outlying homesteads and ranches, creating a communal atmosphere that transcended usual social divisions. The reaction to Gabriel and Harriet's arrival reminded her of their wedding day, though with notable differences. Then curious stares had followed them, the abandoned mail-order bride and her scarred rescuer creating speculation about convenience rather than affection. Now their arrival generated different attention, recognition of the double bar's significance. In local society, respect for Gabriel's position as a substantial landowner, and interest in Harriet as the previously unknown wife now established in the community. "Mrs. Stone, how wonderful to see you again." Mrs. Bailey approached immediately, her merchant's awareness of social dynamics evident in her warm greeting. "And Mr. Stone, we've missed seeing you at town gatherings. The harvest dance is always better attended when prominent ranchers participate." Gabriel acknowledged the welcome with more ease than Harriet had anticipated, handling subsequent introductions and conversations with a dignity that commanded respect despite occasional poorly concealed glances at his scarred cheek. His natural intelligence and comprehensive knowledge of territorial matters gradually overcame initial awkwardness, drawing others into substantive discussions that rendered appearance increasingly irrelevant. Harriet found herself moving between conversations with newfound confidence, her position as Gabriel Stone's wife opening doors to interactions that would have been unavailable to her as either a Boston schoolteacher or an abandoned bride. She gathered useful information about regional developments, exchanged household management strategies with other ranchers' wives, and established connections that could prove valuable for both ranch operations and personal support. When the musicians began the evening's entertainment, Gabriel surprised her by extending his hand in invitation. "I'm not accomplished at dancing," he warned quietly. "The war ended that particular skill, along with several others. But I can manage a simple waltz if you're willing to accept limited proficiency." Harriet placed her hand in his without hesitation. "I prefer sincerity to skill in all things, Mr. Stone." They moved onto the lantern-lit dance floor, Gabriel's slight stiffness from old injuries evident only to those who knew to look for it. What others might have seen was simply a rancher and his wife participating in community traditions, a tableau of normalcy that belied the complex journey that had brought them to this moment. As they circled with other couples beneath the starlit sky, Harriet realized how dramatically her expectations had transformed in the months since arriving in Colorado. The security she had sought in Theodore Patterson's promises now seemed shallow compared to the partnership she had found with Gabriel, a relationship tested by genuine challenges rather than constructed from convenient fictions. "Penny for your thoughts," Gabriel said softly as they navigated the dance floor's perimeter. "I was thinking about expectations versus reality," Harriet replied honestly. "How what we think we want isn't always what we truly need." Gabriel's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "And have you found what you need at the double bar?" The question contained complexities beyond its simple phrasing, uncertainty about whether their evolving arrangement satisfied her expectations, concern that the mounting challenges might overwhelm whatever contentment she had found, perhaps even lingering doubt about his adequacy as a partner given his physical limitations and the dangers now facing the ranch. "I've found more than I knew to look for," Harriet answered, holding his gaze steadily. "Partnership based on respect, rather, than convenience. Purpose beyond mere security. Challenges that reveal capabilities I never knew I possessed." Something in Gabriel's expression shifted at her words, a guardedness giving way to vulnerable hope. "The double bar has transformed since your arrival, Harriet, not just in practical operations, though your organizational skills have certainly improved those. You've brought life back to spaces that had become merely functional." The admission clearly cost him something in pride. This acknowledgement that his self-sufficient existence had lacked essential qualities until her arrival. Before Harriet could respond, however, the moment was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the gathering. Sheriff Donovan was making his way through the crowd with urgent purpose, heading directly toward them. "Stone," he called as he approached, his expression grave beneath his usual courteous manner. "Mrs. Stone, I apologize for the interruption, but I've just received word you should hear immediately." Gabriel maintained his composure, though Harriet felt the immediate tension in his posture. "What's happened, Sheriff?" "Your man Cooper dispatched a rider, young Tyler, with news." Donovan glanced at the surrounding dancers, lowering his voice. "There's been another incident at the Double Bar, more serious than previous ones." Harriet's hand tightened instinctively on Gabriel's arm, steadying them both. "How serious?" "Fire. Again, but not outbuildings this time. Someone attempted to burn the main house." Donovan's expression conveyed the significance. "Your hands managed to contain it to the east wing, but there's substantial damage. And this time, they left a message." "What kind of message?" Gabriel's voice remained controlled despite the alarming news. "A written offer nailed to your front door. Consolidated Western Mining offers to purchase the Double Bar before further accidents diminish its value. Signed by their regional director and witnessed by Edward Campbell." The directness of the threat represented a significant escalation, moving from deniable harassment to explicit intimidation coupled with arson. Around them, the harvest dance continued, couples circling in blissful ignorance of the crisis unfolding. In their midst, the contrast between communal celebration and personal emergency created a dreamlike quality that Harriet would later recall as the moment everything changed. "We need to return immediately," Gabriel said, already scanning the crowd for Martinez. "Please convey our apologies to the organizers, Sheriff." "I've taken the liberty of having your buggy prepared," Donovan replied, "and I'll be riding with you. Attempted arson as intimidation for property acquisition falls squarely within my jurisdiction, regardless of how remote the location." Within 30 minutes, they were on the road back to the Double Bar, the festive clothes now incongruous with their grim purpose. Gabriel drove with controlled urgency, pushing the horses as fast as safety permitted on the darkened road. Harriet sat beside him, her mind already cataloguing what would need addressing when they arrived. Damage assessment, temporary accommodations if necessary, support for hands who had fought the fire. "I'm sorry about the house," Gabriel said quietly. "During a relatively smooth stretch of road, I know you've invested considerable effort in making it a home. Buildings can be repaired," Harriet replied with practical certainty. "What matters is that no one was injured. This changes the nature of our situation," he continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Harassment of operations was concerning, but manageable. Direct attack on our home crosses boundaries that cannot be ignored." Harriet heard the shift in his phrasing. "Our home," rather than "the main house" or "my property." The distinction reflected their evolving relationship, partnership blending into shared identity through crisis response. "What options do we have beyond what we've already implemented?" "Legal action against Campbell and Consolidated Western, with the sheriff's documentation strengthening our position." Gabriel guided the buggy around a particularly rutted section of road. "Accelerated diversification to strengthen our position economically. And," he hesitated slightly, "I'm considering sending you to stay with Elizabeth in Denver while the situation stabilizes." "Absolutely not," Harriet responded immediately, her tone brooking no argument. "Separation would achieve exactly what they want, disrupting our operations, demonstrating vulnerability, and suggesting that intimidation tactics are effective." Gabriel glanced at her, surprise giving way to something like pride. "Elizabeth said something similar when I suggested she remain in Denver after our parents died. Stone women seem particularly resistant to sensible precautions." "I'm not leaving the Double Bar," Harriet stated firmly. Whatever challenges we face together. The declaration hung between them, its implications extending beyond the immediate crisis to the fundamental nature of their relationship. What had begun as convenience had transformed through shared purpose and mutual respect into genuine partnership, one sufficiently strong to withstand deliberate attacks without fracturing under pressure. As the road curved to reveal the distant lights of the double bar, some clearly the wandering lanterns of men still securing the property after the fire, Harriet felt an unexpected emotion rising beneath her practical concerns and righteous anger. Determination, certainly, but something more fundamental, a fierce protectiveness toward this place and partnership that transcended contracts or arrangements or even normal marital bonds. The woman who had arrived seeking mere security now found herself transformed by circumstances into someone willing to defend what she valued, regardless of risk or conventional expectations. The mail-order bride, abandoned at Summit Creek Station, had become a rancher's wife in the truest sense, not through ceremony or sentiment, but through conscious choice to stand firm against forces seeking to destroy what she and Gabriel had built together. What awaited them in the burned east wing of the ranch house would require every measure of this newfound strength, every ounce of the partnership they had forged through previous challenges. Yet as the buggy approached the ranch yard, where concerned hands gathered to report the full extent of the damage, Harriet felt not fear, but resolution. Whatever came next, they would face it not as victim and rescuer, nor even as husband and wife in the conventional sense, but as true partners whose bond had been tested and strengthened through transformation neither could have anticipated when they first met in Summit Creek, Colorado territory. Spring 1879. The North Fork Valley emerged from winter's grip with renewed vitality. Snowmelt feeding streams that coursed through irrigation channels newly dug across the double bar's expanding agricultural operations. Where cattle had once grazed exclusively, orderly rows of early crops now stretched toward the sun, while freshly planted fruit tree saplings stood like sentinels along the creek bend, staked against spring winds as they established roots in promising soil. The ranch house, repaired and expanded after the fire, stood as testament to resilience and vision rather than mere restoration. The damaged east wing had been rebuilt with improvements, larger windows capturing mountain views, a dedicated office for Harriet adjoining Gabriel's study, and a covered porch wrapping around to connect with the original structure. What had been designed as practical living quarters had evolved into a true home, reflecting the partnership of its inhabitants. The irrigation system functions better than expected, Martinez reported as he, Gabriel, and Harriet surveyed the Northfield from horseback. Flow rate exceeds projections by 15%. We can expand the cultivated acreage accordingly. The Denver agricultural supplier confirms our seed order will arrive next week, Harriet added, consulting her notebook. And the contract with Granite Junction Mining Camp is finalized. They'll take all the fresh produce we can deliver this season at premium prices. Gabriel nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression as he studied the transformed landscape. The defensive strategy implemented after the house fire had evolved into something more profound, not merely protection of existing assets, but reimagining the double bar's fundamental identity and purpose. Sheriff Donovan's official investigation had created immediate consequences. With physical evidence of arson and the explicit threat left behind, he had secured arrest warrants for 2 of Campbell's hands identified by distinctive boot prints. At the scene, their subsequent testimony, exchanged for reduced charges, had implicated both Campbell and Consolidated Western's regional director in the escalating campaign against the double bar. The legal proceedings that followed created ripples throughout the territory. What might have remained an isolated property dispute instead became a public referendum on development methods and ethics. The territorial governor, initially reluctant to involve himself in private conflicts, found political advantage in championing legitimate ranching interests against exploitative mining practices. Judge Wilson says the final disposition of Campbell's case will be announced next week, Gabriel remarked as they rode toward the main compound. His property will likely be auctioned to settle the damages awarded in our civil suit. There's interest from the Cooper's eldest son in acquiring it, Harriet noted. He's proposed maintaining the water rights arrangement we negotiated as part of the settlement. This outcome represented more than mere victory in a property dispute. The cooperative water management plan Harriet had developed, drawing on her father's legal background and Gabriel's practical knowledge of the land, had become a model examined by neighboring counties facing similar conflicts between agricultural and mining interests. The double bar itself had transformed physically and philosophically. Where Gabriel had once envisioned primarily a cattle operation with himself as the principal decision-maker, the ranch had evolved into a diversified enterprise, with distributed leadership capitalizing on individual strengths. Matthews continued, overseeing the cattle operation, Martinez directed agricultural expansion, Gabriel managed external relationships and strategic planning, while Harriet coordinated financial systems and ensured all components functioned as an integrated whole. As they approached the ranch yard, signs of this evolution appeared in every direction. New hands hired specifically for crop management, expanded stables housing teams needed for diverse operations, the recently constructed storage facilities designed for agricultural products rather than merely ranch supplies. Even the bunkhouse had been improved and expanded, acknowledging that workforce stability contributed to overall ranch success. Most telling was the addition beside the main house, a modest schoolroom where young Tyler and the children of married hands gathered 3 afternoons weekly for lessons conducted by Harriet. What had begun as informal reading instruction during the winter had developed into a structured educational program that drew positive attention from surrounding communities. Mrs. Hollister from town will be visiting the school tomorrow, Harriet mentioned as they dismounted near the main house. The church committee is considering a similar arrangement for outlying homesteads too distant from Summit Creek for daily attendance. Your teaching background is finally finding proper application, Gabriel observed, the warmth in his tone reflecting more than mere approval of practical skills deployment. Their relationship had evolved alongside the ranch itself, from arrangement to partnership to something deeper that neither felt compelled to define in conventional terms. The boundaries initially established for their marriage of convenience had gradually dissolved, not through dramatic gestures or sentimental declarations, but through the natural progression of shared purpose, mutual respect, and genuine care, demonstrated through daily choices rather than rehearsed romanticism. The evening found them on the new porch, watching spring twilight settle over the valley that had become their shared project. A letter from Elizabeth in Denver lay on the small table between them, containing news of her family and gossip about territorial politics alongside updates on financial arrangements supporting the Double Bar's continued expansion. Elizabeth writes that Theodore Patterson has established himself in St. Louis, Harriet remarked, her tone reflecting how completely that disappointment had transformed from personal injury to historical footnote. Apparently he's engaged to a banker's daughter there. Should we send a wedding present? Gabriel suggested with the dry humor that had emerged more frequently as their comfort with each other deepened. Perhaps a volume on contract law and the consequences of abandonment. Harriet smiled at the jest, appreciating the ease with which they could now reference her inauspicious arrival in Colorado. I prefer letting the past remain past. His actions, disappointing as they were at the time, redirected my path in ways I've come to value beyond measure. The simple statement encompassed the journey neither could have anticipated when Gabriel had approached her table at the Summit Creek Hotel. The Boston schoolteacher seeking security after abandonment, and the scarred rancher proposing practical arrangement rather than emotional connection, each finding in the other capabilities and character that transcended initial expectations. "Judge Wilson mentioned something interesting when I was in town yesterday," Gabriel said, after a comfortable silence. "The territorial legislature is considering legislation modeled on our water rights agreement, establishing frameworks for shared resource management between agricultural and mining interests. Matthews would say that's putting a mighty big hat on a simple fence line agreement," Harriet observed, though pride colored her tone despite the modest framing. "It's more than that," Gabriel countered. "It's recognition that prosperity doesn't require competition at the expense of others. The double bar has demonstrated that diversification and cooperation create more sustainable outcomes than single-purpose exploitation." This perspective represented perhaps the most profound transformation of all, from defensive protection of individual interests to vision for community development that balanced legitimate needs against short-term opportunism. What had begun as response to direct threats had evolved into a model with implications beyond their own property lines. As darkness settled over the valley, lights appeared in the bunkhouse and the homes of married hands, creating a constellation of human presence across the landscape. Compared to the isolated outpost Harriet had first encountered, the double bar had become a community unto itself, while simultaneously strengthening connections with Summit Creek and surrounding properties. "I received another letter today," Harriet said, as the first stars appeared above the mountains, "from a woman in Denver whose fiancé abandoned their arrangement. She read about our situation in a newspaper account of the Campbell trial and sought advice about her prospects." "What did you tell her?" Gabriel asked, genuine interest evident in his tone. "That disappointment sometimes opens doors we wouldn't otherwise consider," Harriet replied. "That character revealed through actions matters more than promises easily made and broken, that partnerships built on mutual respect and shared purpose offer foundations stronger than conventional romantic narratives suggest." "Wisdom is hard-earned," Gabriel noted, reaching across the space between their chairs to take her hand, a gesture that had transformed from surprising to natural over the months of their evolving relationship. "But worth the learning," Harriet concluded, her fingers interlacing with his as naturally as their lives had intertwined through choice rather than initial circumstance. Above them, stars multiplied across the darkening sky, bearing witness to a legacy neither could have envisioned. When first meeting as practical strangers, forming an arrangement of convenience, the mail-order bride abandoned at Summit Creek Station, and the scarred rancher, who had claimed her 5 days later, had built something that transcended personal salvation or mere economic partnership. A model demonstrating that true security came not from avoiding risk, but from facing challenges alongside those whose strengths complemented one's own. As mountain breezes carried the scent of spring growth across the valley, Harriet and Gabriel Stone continued their quiet conversation on the porch of the home they had created together. Two people who had found in disappointment's aftermath not merely consolation, but transformation, their individual journeys merging into shared legacy that would influence their community long after the unusual circumstances of their first meeting faded into historical footnote. In the end, what had begun as desperate pragmatism had blossomed into something neither had dared. Seek partnership based on genuine value rather than convenience. Home created through shared vision rather than social expectation, and love manifested through daily choices rather than flowery sentiments easily spoken but rarely proven through adversity's revealing test. Colorado, 1883. The whistle of an approaching train echoed through the valley, a sound that once signaled uncertainty and disappointment for Harriet Stone, but now merely marked the rhythm of a thriving community. Summit Creek had grown from frontier outpost to respectable town, with the newly completed rail spur connecting it directly to Denver and points east. Where a simple station platform had once stood, a proper depot now welcomed visitors and commerce alike. Among those waiting as the train pulled in was Harriet, her practical riding clothes replaced for the occasion by a stylish but sensible burgundy traveling suit. At 35, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had discovered her true capabilities through challenges rather than comfort. The mail-order bride, abandoned without ceremony, had become a central figure in regional development, her intelligence and practical nature finding expression beyond anything she could have imagined in Boston. "Ain't Harriet?" A young voice pierced the steam billowing around the arriving train. Elizabeth's daughter Margaret emerged first, 12 years old and vibrant despite the long journey, followed by Elizabeth herself and her husband David, a professor, whose academic connections had proven valuable for the Double Bar's agricultural innovations. "Welcome to Summit Creek," Harriet greeted them with genuine warmth. Gabriel would have come himself, but the territorial governor's inspection couldn't be rescheduled. "Inspection of what this time?" Elizabeth asked as they collected luggage. "More agricultural experiments or water management projects?" "Both," Harriet replied with understated pride. "The North Fork Valley Cooperative has been designated a model for regional development. Officials from Wyoming and Montana territories arrive next week to study our methods." The transformation that had begun with the Double Bar's diversification had expanded beyond single property innovations into a cooperative alliance of neighboring ranches. What started as defensive response to external threats had evolved into proactive community development, with the Stones serving as catalysts rather than mere participants. As they rode in the Double Bar wagon toward the ranch, Harriet pointed out markers of this evolution: new businesses in town catering to agricultural commerce rather than just mining supplies, homesteads with irrigated fields where once only subsistence grazing had been attempted, and community projects like the recently completed schoolhouse that served families throughout the valley. "The governor's office is considering your water management framework for territorial legislation," David remarked, his academic interest in policy development evident. "I've been corresponding with several legislators about the legal precedents you've established." "It's less about legal innovation than practical necessity," Harriet responded, though she appreciated the recognition. "When resources are limited, cooperation produces better outcomes than competition, a lesson we learned through difficult experience rather than theoretical understanding." The Double Bar itself came into view as they crested the final rise. The ranch compound now expanded into what amounted to a small village. The original house, nearly doubled in size through thoughtful additions, stood at the center. Surrounding it were purpose-built structures reflecting the diversified operation: processing facilities for agricultural products, expanded barns for livestock and equipment, housing for the increased workforce required by more labor-intensive farming. Most prominently, a new building with large windows and a small bell tower stood near the main house, the research station and educational center that represented the Double Bar's most innovative contribution to regional development. Here, agricultural techniques were tested, documentation maintained, and training provided for neighboring ranchers interested in diversification. "Gabriel said you've added another scientist to your research team," Elizabeth commented as they passed the facility. "Dr. Wilson from the Denver Agricultural College," Harriet confirmed. "He's developing drought-resistant wheat varieties specifically adapted to our elevation and soil conditions. The territorial government has provided partial funding since our results are made available to all producers without restriction." This commitment to shared knowledge, rather than proprietary advantage, characterized the philosophy that had developed through the Stones' partnership, recognition that regional prosperity created greater security than isolated success. The position didn't reflect naive idealism, but practical understanding that sustainable growth required collective advancement rather than individual opportunism. As they approached the main house, a small figure darted from the porch. A boy, of 4 with dark hair and his father's grey-blue eyes, though his face bore no scars, only the natural enthusiasm of childhood unburdened by war's harsh legacy. "Thomas, wait for Aunt Elizabeth to stop the wagon," called Gabriel, appearing on the porch with a slightly slower step than in earlier years, but the same straight-backed dignity that had caught Harriet's attention during their first meeting. Boy ignored this caution, racing toward the wagon with complete confidence that he would be caught and lifted by his mother, as indeed he was. Harriet embraced her son with the natural ease she had discovered in motherhood, a role she had never specifically sought but embraced with the same practical dedication she brought to all meaningful endeavors. "He's grown so much," Elizabeth marveled as she descended from the wagon to greet her brother. The siblings embraced with genuine affection, Gabriel's initial reserve having gradually thawed through years of renewed connection. "And he has your eyes, though thankfully Harriet's patience." "Limited patience today," Gabriel corrected with a smile that transformed his scarred face with genuine warmth. "He's been watching for the wagon since dawn, convinced his favorite aunt would arrive by breakfast." The expanded house welcomed them all with the comfortable atmosphere of a home designed for both practicality and genuine living. Where the original structure had reflected bachelor austerity modified by Caroline's feminine touches, the current incarnation revealed the blended sensibilities of its inhabitants. Gabriel's appreciation for quality materials and sturdy construction, complemented by Harriet's attention to comfort and functionality. Books filled shelves in every room, maps and documents shared space with family photographs, and evidence of young Thomas's enthusiastic exploration appeared in carefully preserved collections of rocks, feathers, and botanical specimens. That evening, after Thomas had finally been persuaded to sleep despite the excitement of visitors, the adults gathered in the study that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in Harriet and Gabriel's journey. From arrangement to partnership to family, the conversation flowed easily between personal updates and broader developments. The boundaries between family matters and community concerns as naturally integrated as the lives of those discussing them. "The Summit Creek Council has approved funds for a proper library," Gabriel informed his sister. Harriet's proposal for combining it with adult education programs was particularly persuasive. "We're adapting some of your husband's university extension models," Harriet explained to Elizabeth. "Evening classes in agricultural science, basic business management, and regional history. Martinez is developing a course on traditional water management techniques that predate American settlement." "And you've been asked to teach?" David inquired. "Among other responsibilities," Harriet acknowledged, "I'll be serving as head of the library committee and teaching several courses." What remained unmentioned but understood was how completely Harriet's original quest for basic security had transformed into confident community leadership. The woman who had arrived seeking mere safe harbor now helped chart the course for regional development, her natural intelligence and organizational abilities finding expression in increasingly wider spheres. Later, as Elizabeth and David retired to their guest room and the house settled into nighttime silence, Harriet and Gabriel found themselves alone on the porch that had become their traditional place for reflection. The valley spread before them in moonlight, its contours familiar yet constantly evolving through their stewardship and vision. "I received a letter from Sheriff Donovan today," Gabriel mentioned, his tone suggesting news of significance. Theodore Patterson has returned to Summit Creek. Harriet absorbed this information with mild surprise, but no distress. After all these years, what brings him back? Apparently, his St. Louis ventures failed. He's seeking to establish himself in familiar territory, though Donovan says he appears much diminished from the prominent merchant he once portrayed himself as. The revelation prompted reflection rather than resentment. The man, whose abandonment had once seemed life-altering, now appeared as a minor character in a story that had developed in directions neither could have anticipated. "Should we invite him to dinner?" Harriet suggested, her tone lightly ironic. "Show him the life his broken promises inadvertently made possible?" Gabriel's rare laugh emerged, warm and genuine, generosity beyond what's deserved, though perhaps fitting. The man indirectly gave me what I never thought to find again after the war: purpose beyond mere survival, partnership beyond practical. Arrangement. Harriet reached for his hand, the gesture natural after years of such connections, and gave me what Boston propriety never permitted: the chance to discover capabilities beyond prescribed limitations, to build rather than merely maintain. As night deepened around them, their conversation turned from past twists of fate to future possibilities: Thomas's education, expanded agricultural research, community development projects under consideration. The abandoned bride and the scarred rancher had created legacy that extended far beyond their personal redemption, establishing patterns of cooperation and sustainable development that would influence the territory long after the unusual circumstances of their first meeting faded from community memory. What would endure was the model they had created together: partnership based on mutual respect rather than prescribed roles. Success measured by community benefit rather than mere personal gain, and love manifested through daily choices that consistently valued shared purpose over individual convenience. In the end, what began as desperate pragmatism had produced wisdom. Neither could have developed in more comfortable circumstances. The mail-order bride abandoned at Summit Creek Station, and the scarred rancher who had claimed her 5 days later had discovered life's most meaningful securities came not from avoiding risk, but from facing challenges alongside those whose strengths complemented one's own, a legacy worth more than any conventional happy ending could have provided. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and go check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.